Hi everyone. In this lecture, you're going to learn about epidemiology, which is really important these days. And we're also going to learn about something called the chain of infection, which is how infection keeps going in a society. So it'll be very relevant with what's going on in the world today with coronavirus. So when we talk about the chain of infection, we'll talk about ways to break infection as well. Okay, so with some background, we're going to start off with epidemiology, chain of infection, and the trends of disease that we're seeing these days, specifically with healthcare associated infections. To start off with epidemiology, epidemiology is the study of distribution and causes of disease in populations. Basically, epidemiologists, what they do is they study three things. They study the timing of a disease so that they can better understand why it happened at a certain time. Was it during the winter season, summer season? Is that significant for anything? They study the location where the disease happened. Was something going on in the specific city that the disease happened, something with the water source or any other contamination that happened? And transmission, how is the disease spread? Is it spread through people eating contaminated food or drinking contaminated water, or maybe blood transmission? So anything like that. So epidemiologists are really the scientists that put all the information together to try to come up with a way to control a disease once they know the timing, location, and transmission of a disease. And in the case of coronavirus, epidemiologists figured out that it came about in 2019, coronavirus. The location, it started out in Wuhan, China. Transmission, we now know that it transmits through airdrops, so person-to-person contact. Now I want to talk about communicable versus non-communicable diseases. So in disease, we can spread diseases out as either communicable or non-communicable. A communicable disease is basically any disease that is contagious. So a disease that can be transmitted from one person to another is a communicable disease. We also call these infectious diseases. So HIV, you can get that. Most bacterial infections, most viral infections, anything that you can get from someone else is a communicable disease. Something that is not transmitted from one person to another is a non-communicable disease. So a very good example of this is cancer. You cannot get cancer from someone else. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, different chronic respiratory diseases, not ones that are caused by bacteria or viruses. So I want you guys to know these terms because epidemiologists use these terms a lot. And as you all know now, coronavirus is a very communicable disease. Okay, epidemiologists, because they study timing, location, and transmission of disease, they put all this information together and they publish a lot of reports. These reports are very important in getting us to understand a disease so that we know how to control it. So there's something called reportable diseases or nationally notifiable diseases. And these are diseases that are of great public concern to people. So they have to be reported to public health agencies. So if you go to your doctor because you have like a simple bacterial infection like strep throat, or if you have a simple cold, that's not a reportable disease. A reportable disease is something that is serious and we're scared for the general public, so it has to be reported. And so in the United States, we report it to local agencies, state agencies, national agencies, and then International Agency of Health is the World Health Organization. So the United States Health Organization is the CDC, and then when we're talking about all countries, we're talking about the World Health Organization. So just keep this in mind, and there are many nationally reportable diseases. The CDC collects and analyzes epidemiological information all the time and publishes these MMWR reports, which are weekly reports. If any of you guys are interested, like for example, if you right now go on the CDC website and you put MMWR, you're going to see a ton of reports, weekly reports about coronavirus. I think the last one I read was about prison inmates and healthcare workers. So they publish these reports all the time talking about major concerns that we have right now. And it's specifically centered toward the US because it is the CDC. So actually, let me go back. Okay, so there are many nationally notifiable diseases, and I used to go on the CDC website and cut and paste them here for everyone. There's a lot. I didn't cut and paste them. I just wanted to put a few here that you guys have heard of. We've talked about either in lab or lecture. So anthrax, which is caused by bacteria, that's on there. If someone has anthrax, we have to report it. Botulism, which is caused by bacteria. Remember Clostridium botulinum. If it's foodborne, infant wound, it has to be reported. Different bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. So remember we talked about bacteria that have the carpinamus gene, which gives them the ability to break down the antibiotic carpinaum. So these we have to report. Coronavirus is now on that list. It was not on that list last year, so I wanted to highlight that. Polio is there, tuberculosis, tetanus, vancomycin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So a lot of diseases, there's a lot more diseases are on there, especially if we give vaccines for those diseases. So if we see an outbreak, the CDC wants to know and the state wants to know for various reasons. They want to know, are people not getting vaccinated? Did something happen with people who were vaccinated and maybe they're immune now or resistant to something? So keep that in mind with these lists. Okay, now we're going to talk about infectious diseases worldwide. So worldwide, we see that developing regions have a high amount of death by communicable diseases. Remember, these are the contagious ones that can be transmitted from person to person as compared to developed regions. When we look at developing regions, these communicable diseases, they're infectious diseases, so a lot of them can be stopped by antibiotics, by vaccines. So we notice that when we look at developed countries do not have a high amount of communicable diseases. This shows us that in developing countries, it's more a lack of resources than anything else, which you guys already know, but just keep that in mind for what people study in epidemiology. So why, for example, in certain countries in Asia or Africa, we see diseases that are completely preventable, communicable diseases that we have antibiotics for, we have vaccines for. So in the US, we do not see as high amount of communicable diseases as we do in other countries. Now I want to talk about three terms which I think will be useful for everyone, especially with everything going on. So I want everyone to know morbidity rate, mortality rate, and fatality rate. So these are three different terms that mean different things. Morbidity rate is basically the illness rate in a population. So you take how many people are sick and you divide it by the total population. So with the morbidity rate, I'm going to use coronavirus as an example. And I got the latest numbers as of today. So I just put May 2020. Okay, so when I looked at the COVID-19 confirmed cases in the United States, now I'm being just specific to the United States, it was about 1.2 million people as of today have COVID-19. So with morbidity rate, you take the number of people sick over the total population. The total population of the US is about 330 million people. So when you divide the number sick over the total population and you multiply by 100 because it's a percent, COVID-19 has a 0.3 morbidity rate in the US as of today. Now, these numbers are not exactly accurate because we could have a lot more people sick who are not reporting for various reasons. But as of right now, this is the morbidity rate with the current numbers we have. It's 0.3% illness of COVID-19 in the US. Other two terms I want to talk about are prevalence and incidence. Prevalence is the number of people with a disease at a given time. So it's the number of existing cases. How prevalent a disease is an example is we can say 10% of the American population has diabetes in 2018. So when I looked at that data, that's the number I got, is that about 2 years ago, 10% of Americans had diabetes. That's how prevalent it was. That's the number of existing cases. So prevalence with COVID-19 would be the number of existing cases right now of COVID-19, the disease. Incidence is the number of new cases. So we can say that the incidence of diabetes is going up in the US, so the number of new cases. So just know that prevalence is existing cases, incidence is new cases. The next term we're going to talk about is mortality rate. Mortality rate is basically death rate per population. So it's over the total number of people in a population. So when we look at coronavirus, we see in the United States about 70,000 deaths as of today, and our population is 330 million. So when you divide the number of deaths over the population for the United States, I got 0.02% mortality rate. So it means when we look at all of the United States, COVID-19 will have a death rate or mortality rate of 0.02%. Okay, the big numbers that you guys have been seeing in the media is fatality rate. So fatality rate is when we take the number of people who have died from a disease over the number of sick people. Mortality rate was over the whole population. So with mortality rate, we're saying in all of the US, COVID-19 has 0.02% mortality rate. That's the death rate. Fatality rate is the number who have died from a disease over the number who are sick. So when we look at COVID-19 as an example, the number of people who have died from it is around 70,000, and the number of confirmed cases right now is about 1.2 million. So when you take 70,000, this exact number, and you divide it by 1.2 million and you multiply by 100 because it's a percent, I got about 6% fatality rate. That's a huge number. So when you tell someone a disease has a 6% fatality rate, 6%, it means that 6% of all people who are getting the disease are dying. This is a big number. Now, the one reason why this number may not be exactly accurate is the number of people sick. There are, as you guys know and we've discussed, a lot of people could be sick and have not gotten tested and they've just had it. So this number might be a lot bigger. I assume that this number is a lot bigger than the reported number. And if our denominator, so the bottom number in the fraction, is bigger, then the fatality rate goes down. But right now, plugging in the numbers, it's 5.8% fatality rate. And again, fatality is the number of people who have the disease over the number of people, who've died from a disease over the total number of people who are sick of the disease. And then a few more terms which we've talked about in a lab PowerPoint. So a disease, in epidemiology, we say a disease is sporadic if it only occurs occasionally and irregularly. So you could say meningococcal disease is an example, but it's so rare. So I guess you could say it's a sporadic disease. Endemic is when the disease is constantly present in the usual frequency. So just the usual amount of people having a common cold would be an endemic. Epidemic is when the disease is much bigger than what's expected. So we say that's an outbreak. So we have an outbreak of Ebola at one point in our country. And then pandemic is when the outbreak becomes worldwide. And again, pandemic worldwide comes from Pangea, when all the continents were one. So it's from the geography term. So right now with coronavirus, it went from being an epidemic in China to being a pandemic where now it's worldwide. So I think most of you know these terms, unfortunately, from everything going on. But if you didn't, I hope you guys know these terms by now. Now we're going to talk about something that's very important in microbiology and just medical science in general, called the chain of infection. The chain of infection says that in infection, there are various links when we have like an outbreak of infection that keep an infection going, keep it propagating. All these links are basically, I was going to say all these links are linked to each other, but that's what the name is. So there are all these chains that are linked to each other, and by all of them happening again and again is how you keep infection going. So for example, in an infection, one link of an infection is the pathogen. You need a pathogen, portal of entry, reservoir of the infectious agent, portal of exit, mode of transmission, susceptible host. So you have someone get a pathogen, it keeps getting transmitted, and you keep having this chain. And I'm going to go over each one specifically. So this is what the chain of infection says. It says that we keep an infection going because of all these links. But if we break the chain of infection, then we can stop infection. And so we're going to describe, I'm going to go through each of the links of infection with all the chains of all the links of the chain of infection, and then we're going to talk about, okay, what are ways to stop infection at each one of these links? How can we break the chain of infection? So we're going to start off by an important chain of infection link is the pathogen. To have an infection keep going, to have an outbreak, to have an epidemic, to have a pandemic, you have to have a pathogen. And different types of pathogens mean different things. So a bacterial outbreak is different than a viral outbreak, is different than a parasitic outbreak. So like if you think of a malaria outbreak, virulence, how virulent something is. So in the chain of infection, we think about, okay, how much does it cause disease? How bad is it? That's what virulence is. So we're going to use coronavirus COVID-19 right now as an example. And when I say coronavirus, I just want everyone to know I'm referring to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, because coronavirus, again, is a big family of viruses, but I'm just going to say coronavirus moving forward, and COVID-19 is a disease. So for our chain of infection with what's going on right now, this infection that's not stopping worldwide, our pathogen is SARS-CoV-2 virus. Virulence, it's pretty virulent. It has different virulence factors that make people sick. So it attaches to receptors on lung cells, and it likes those receptors. It infects those cells. That's why it's making people pretty sick. Infectious dose, you don't need a high number of the virus to be sick. So infectious dose is how much of a pathogen you need to get sick. We also take into consideration in the chain of infection, one characteristic of the pathogen is the incubation period, meaning how long someone can be infected without showing symptoms. Long incubation periods of pathogens make them very, very easily spread, easily transmitted. So with coronavirus, we're seeing different types of incubation periods, but let's just use a standard of 2 weeks incubation period. Okay, if we say 2 weeks, if we're saying that someone between 5 days to 2 weeks it takes for them to potentially show symptoms, they can infect a lot of people. So this is one part of it. Okay, the second thing we're going to talk about is how a pathogen enters someone, so the portal of entry. So every pathogen has a preferred site of entering, and most common is the respiratory tract. We're going to talk about this in the respiratory tract lecture, but if you guys can imagine, the reason that the most common portal of entry for pathogens is the respiratory tract is because the respiratory tract, you breathe all the time. So it's always open, we're breathing all the time. The second most common portal of entry is digestive, because we also eat. And then also if your skin or mucous membranes are opened up, respiratory pathogens generally cause diseases when inhaled, so that's why they're very common. Intestinal pathogens when eaten. And I want to tell everyone, when I say fecal-oral transmission, I mean when fecal organisms are transported to the mouth and ingested. What I mean by this is people not washing their hands. I mean, no one is touching their feces and going and touching their mouth. It just means that someone didn't wash their hands or didn't wash them well enough and then prepared someone's food. So one way to stop infection at this chain is hand washing. So if you wash hands, then the pathogen can't get in. Wound care, making sure wounds are covered so that pathogens can't get in. Catheter care, being careful not to allow more pathogens in. Aseptic technique. So again, this chain of infection is trying to limit the pathogen's entry. The next chain of infection that we consider in all infections is reservoir. What is the reservoir of infection? What is the source of the infection? With coronavirus, we know, okay, I didn't talk about it in the last slide, but I think you guys all got it. The portal of entry of coronavirus is inhalation. Now, reservoir for COVID-19 infection, it started out from an animal, so it's a zoonotic disease. So it was transmitted from animals to humans. So that was the reservoir. The reservoir was animals, potentially bats. So we can have human reservoirs of disease. Carriers are people who do not show infection. They don't show symptoms, but they're still sick. So we have to be careful of them. That's why healthcare workers, you're working with very vulnerable populations who are sick. So that's why you have to make sure that you're not getting too close. You're well covered, because you could be carrying something that is a potential pathogen for someone who's vulnerable. And then zoonotic, environmental reservoirs, soil and water. You could think of mosquitoes in certain environments. Maybe you have like a lake that's not a lake, like a warm pond that's harboring a lot of mosquitoes that carry disease. So that environment is a reservoir of our pathogens. Some ways to stop diseases at this link is to disinfect or sterilize the environment, environmental sanitation, potentially antibiotics, so maybe in animals and humans taking care of their health. So if humans are carriers, making sure that they're wearing masks, for example, in healthcare settings. So with coronavirus, the reservoir of infection, okay, started off being animals. So you would have to, one way to stop that link is to be careful when handling animals, especially animals that we know carry a lot of coronaviruses, and also human carriers, healthy carriers. So they are a huge reservoir, young, healthy carriers, not just young, but I'm using young as an example because we do have a lot of individuals who are young, who are carriers but are not showing symptoms, so they have to be careful. And so one way of stopping disease at this link is just human health, them making sure that they're not releasing the virus, which is why we're wearing masks and quarantining. Another chain of infection, okay, so someone can get an infection, but you don't have a chain of infection unless it keeps infecting people. So if a pathogen is not exiting the host and going on to infect more people, then you kind of stop infection. So portals of exit for pathogens, respiratory tract, coughing and sneezing is one way that respiratory pathogens leave. Gastrointestinal tract, pathogens can exit that tract by saliva or by feces. This is why we wash our hands. It's become kind of very common sense to wash our hands, but just know that this was not knowledge many years ago. Now we know that feces do harbor pathogens that we need to be careful of. Genitourinary tract, so pathogens can exit in urine and secretions by genital areas, skin, mucosal surfaces, placenta, blood. Some ways to stop disease at this link is by washing hands. That's the most important thing. So if we know with coronavirus that it's exiting through coughing and sneezing, we want to make sure that we're washing our hands all the time so that we don't propagate this chain of infection. Controlling excretions and secretions, so covering your sneezing, coughing, and appropriate disposal. This is the main reason that we use these sharps container that many of you volunteer in hospitals, so you've seen them. One big reason is because we don't want people to get injected by something that was contagious. So we want to make sure that we appropriately dispose things. This is also the reason why in lab we had the biohazard bags that you guys used to use. So anytime you had slides with bacteria on them, remember we used to put them in the Lysol bowl to make sure that everything dies before we dispose it so that we're not releasing pathogens in the environment. And then another chain of infection is transmission. So there are different ways of transmission. We're going to start off by differentiating vertical and horizontal transmission. Vertical transmission is when a mom transmits a disease to the baby. Everything else is considered horizontal transmission. So only mom to child during childbirth, not when the child is like 10 years old and mom is sick. So during childbirth, if a mom passes on something to the baby, that's vertical transmission. Horizontal transmission is person to person by air, physical contact, eating food or water, vectors, anything like that. Now we're going to talk about different types of contact transmission. Direct contact transmission means that to get the infected, you need to be in close contact with the person or the thing that's contaminated. Indirect contact transmission are things that spread by non-living objects called fomites. So indirect contact transmission is, for example, someone has coronavirus, COVID-19 disease, and they sneeze on, I guess, my pen. This is a good one. Okay, they sneeze on my pen, and then the pen is here, and then I come maybe 10 minutes later, and I use the pen, and then I touch my face. So that's spreading through a fomite, an indirect object. Doorknobs are very common fomites. Droplet transmission is transmission via airborne droplets. That's like someone sneezing or coughing on you. So there's many different things that can be ways of transmission. And then I also want to talk about vehicle transmission and vector transmission. So again, vehicle transmission is transmission by a non-living reservoir, water, air, food. With coronavirus, it's transmitted through living reservoirs. So through humans, it's a human person-to-person contact through droplets. Vector transmission is when a disease is transmitted through vectors. We talked about vectors in the eukaryotic pathogens lab, but anyway, they're basically insects. Arthropods are common vectors, fleas, ticks, mosquitoes. Vectors can be mechanical vectors or biological vectors. So they're spreading disease either by having the microbe on their body, that's called mechanical vector, or a biological vector is where the pathogen participates in the life cycle of the vector. So for example, Plasmodium, which causes malaria, multiplies in mosquitoes before the mosquito goes to infect people. So mosquito has the malaria in it, and the mosquito functions as a biological vector for the parasite. Some ways to stop disease at the transmission level, at that chain control, is vector control. So with malaria, this is very common. If you have an outbreak of malaria in an area, one really good way to limit it is to just kill all the mosquitoes that are harboring that protist. Another one is isolation. This is what we're doing right now. So isolation and quarantine are two different things. Quarantine is basically what we're all doing when you're just staying home. Isolating is when you're not being in contact with anyone. So if I was isolating myself, I'd put myself in a room and not see any of my family members until the pathogen passes its course, the infection does. Food handling, making sure we cook food so that bacteria and different pathogens are not transmitted through food. Airflow control, they're making sure you change filters in the house. There was an outbreak of Legionella a few years ago in Disneyland because of the venting system. Sterilization, hand washing, all of these ways to control infection by stopping transmission. And then susceptible host. We have to think about who's getting infected in the chain of infection. Different things can make someone susceptible or not susceptible to an infection. Immunity is something to consider. So if you have an outbreak of, if you have an outbreak where, I'm going to use last year's flu strain, which I don't have the specific strain memorized. Last year, every year we have a flu strain. Last year we had a flu strain. Let's say that same flu strain from last year came back right now this year. It would not infect all of us because some of us would have built immunity either by previous exposure or by getting vaccination potentially. So that's what makes susceptible hosts. General health, we take into consideration, are people getting good nutrition, overcrowding, fatigue? That's why developing areas have more infections. Remember, we said more communicable infections. Lifestyle and nutrition of the host. Are people smoking? Because as we know right now with coronavirus, smoking, vaping, anything that affects your lungs can make the infection much more worse. Age, the very young and the elderly are generally more susceptible to diseases. Gender different, like females are more susceptible to UTIs than males because of their anatomy. Genetics, inherited traits. So sickle cell anemia is a disorder, but sickle cell anemia also protects people from malaria. So we want to protect susceptible hosts, and one way to do this is to treat underlying diseases if we can and recognize high-risk patients. So when the outbreak first happened with COVID-19, if everyone remembers, elder people were told to stay at home. So elder people, anyone that was immunocompromised, if you had asthma, if you had diabetes, if you had heart problems, so we told them to stay home. And this is what we want to take into consideration with any disease, is that some people are more susceptible than others. So a way to stop disease, because susceptible people will get the disease more, you don't want them out in the population, is to control either if you can control whatever is making them susceptible, otherwise recognizing that population and keeping them quarantined and isolated if they do get sick. So I found this graph that I really liked about the chain of infection and breaking the chain of infection. So we talked about the chain of infection right now. We went through the different things that are involved: pathogen, so stopping the pathogen, how the organism gets in, how the pathogen gets in, how the pathogen exits, reservoirs, transmission, susceptible host, all of these things. So now that you know what keeps an infection going and going, how do you break the infection? I found this, and it has to do with COVID-19. So let's go through it. So one important link in the chain of infection is the pathogen itself. The pathogen for COVID-19 is a virus. It's SARS-CoV-2. We can break the chain by killing the virus, which you can do by hand washing and sanitizing, because we know that high levels, 60% or higher of alcohol, kills the virus because it's an enveloped virus. So that's what you can do. We know the organism is a virus, and this virus basically gets killed by washing hands and cleaning with alcohol products. The reservoir. So the virus lives in the respiratory tract, that's its environment, but it can survive on surfaces, which there's many studies of whether it's hours or days depending on the surface, but we know it can live on surfaces. So one way to break the infection is to pretend that everyone is a healthy carrier of the infection and take precautions to reduce transmission, so covering your mouth, all of that. But mainly assuming that the reservoir of infection is there's a lot of healthy carriers. Next is the chain of infection keeps going as long as the pathogen can exit. So the virus exits through droplets by coughing and sneezing. So one way we can break this is to cover our coughs and sneezes and to wash your hands. So in all of these, one way to stop it is wash your hands. And this is not just for COVID-19, it's for almost most infections. Transmission. The virus is spread through direct contact or indirect contact. So don't shake hands, don't hug, avoid getting too close to people, wear masks, stay home, and don't touch your face, disinfect surfaces. Next part of the chain of infection is The virus enters through the respiratory system, the upper respiratory system. It can enter through your eyes as well. So it enters through nose and mouth, but it can enter through your eyes. So assume everyone's infected and don't touch this area. Don't touch your face, basically. And then finally, susceptible hosts. We know that older people and those with underlying medical conditions, specifically heart conditions, are way more susceptible to getting this. So take care of your immune system, take care of people who are vulnerable and potentially can get a much worse infection if infected. So that was the chain of infection, and this is something we consider with all outbreaks and infections in general. Now, to continue on with our epidemiology lecture, we've seen a lot of different trends in disease. And I want to say that we've seen a lot of reduction in certain diseases and a lot of increase in other diseases. For reduction in diseases, we've seen a high reduction of diseases because of sanitation. We've learned a lot about even right now, people are still learning about how to wash their hands properly. So hopefully with everything we've learned right now with COVID-19, our sanitation will carry on into future years to help protect us against other diseases. Reservoir vector control, we understand now that people can be healthy carriers. So we want to make sure that in healthcare settings, nurses and doctors and PAs and all the other healthcare workers know that they need to stay far away from patients, protect themselves, wear lab coats, all of these things. Control, vector control, if you knowing how to do environmental sanitation better, if you have, for example, a mosquito that's spreading a disease. Vaccination has greatly reduced various diseases. Antibiotics in general have done a great job. We are using them a bit too much now and seeing resistance, but they've done an amazing job of decreasing disease over time. And modifying the environments, bathrooms, toilets, making sure, if you guys know now, we have all the like handless things, and then there's a lot of controversy about the blowing air versus paper towels, but we're learning how to modify environments so that they are more sanitary. But I want to say that we still have a lot of work to do. So over 4 billion people do not have access to toilets at home and hand washing and have to go out in the public. So we want to make sure that we keep this in mind regardless of where we live and all the things that we have. So despite all these great reductions we've seen, we are seeing emerging and re-emerging diseases in recent times. So even though a lot of things are going down, a lot of things are also going up due to changes in our times. So emerging diseases are diseases that are new and they're increasing in incidence or showing potential to increase in the future. Things that are contributing to emerging or re-emerging diseases. So re-emerging diseases are diseases that we stopped seeing and now they're coming back up. Reasons that we're seeing them is microbial evolution. So we're seeing E. coli change and mutate and cause much worse diarrhea than it did before. We're seeing Vibrio cholera mutating as well, gaining different toxins. So keep that in mind, that bacteria with their evolution are gaining different genes, and sometimes these genes make them more pathogenic. They can be gaining antibiotic genes. So widespread use of antibiotics and pesticides is leading to both antibiotic and pesticide resistant strains of different organisms. And this is very tough because now we don't know what to treat all of these antibiotic and pesticide resistant strains with. People are not getting all the vaccines that they should be, so we're seeing outbreaks of various diseases. Changes in human society, it's become so easy to travel the world and go everywhere. So that leads to a lot of re-emerging, more than emerging, but re-emerging diseases. So we're seeing, even with coronavirus, that's a perfect example of a virus that started off in Wuhan, China, and is now spread everywhere. So massive transportation, our food, how we import it all over the world. And then with our environment getting warmer, bugs like warmer weather, so we will see an outbreak of more things. You know, something else I would add on this list that I didn't is potentially all the genetically modified food that we're using. So genetically modified food in general has no good or bad effect. I would say it's neutral with all the research that we're showing, but it could also be leading to various re-emerging diseases we're seeing. So here is an example of emerging infectious diseases. So MERS in Saudi Arabia is a common ancestor of SARS-CoV-2, and that was an emerging infectious disease that came about years ago because of a similar situation with what we had today. The difference between MERS and COVID-19 is MERS was more deadly, so it didn't get a chance to spread as much because a lot of people that got it ended up getting very, very sick, and we had a higher death rate. And for example, swine flu in Mexico, we see E. coli 0157, Vibrio cholera in India, so many different emerging infectious diseases that we're seeing, Ebola, all these things. And now I'm going to talk about healthcare associated infections or nosocomial infections. This is going to be very relevant for all of you guys going into healthcare. And regardless, even if you don't go into healthcare as a profession, this affects all of us because all of us ourselves or our family members or our friends go to hospitals all the time. And I want everyone to know that healthcare associated infections are a very serious thing. They're infections acquired during a stay in a hospital, nursing home, or any healthcare facility, and they're one of the top 10 causes of death in the United States is from healthcare associated infections. So people go to get healthcare for something. Maybe you have like a kidney infection and you go to the hospital for it, and then you end up getting a healthcare associated infection, which can be deadly. So the reason why they're one of the top 10 causes of death, and besides death, one of the top causes of infections in general, is because in hospitals you have dense populations of very susceptible sick people, where you also have the most resistant and virulent pathogens there. You have the worst bugs in the world in the hospital because people are going because they're so sick. So about 5%, 15% of all hospitalized patients develop one of these nosocomial infections. The reason is that hospitals are filled with pathogens, you have immunocompromised hosts, you have overcrowded hospitals, chain of transmission, you have contact, you have surgery, you have reservoirs, beds, all of these things that need to be properly sterilized. So there are a lot of reservoirs of infectious disease in healthcare settings. There's patients all around, and patients are shedding skin cells, respiratory droplets, body secretions. Are you sharing a bathroom with another patient? The healthcare environment generally has a lot of gram-negative bacteria in sinks, ventilators, and toilets. There was a study done that looked at different bacteria that was found in hospital sinks, and we see a lot of gram-negative rods. We also see Pseudomonas aeruginosa as a very common bacteria seen in healthcare environments. And unfortunately, this bacteria is resistant to many disinfectants, and it requires very little to grow. So it can easily grow everywhere, and it can make people have very bad lung infections. So maybe someone comes in with primary infection to the hospital, and Pseudomonas can cause a very bad secondary infection. Healthcare workers, they're carriers of pathogens. You have sick workers. People who are sick go to work all the time. This is unfortunately human nature, and I hope that COVID-19 has taught us to not go to work when we're sick, because not only is it for us, but to protect everyone else. Visitors also are a reservoir of disease, and the patient's own microbiota. So the patient's immunocompromised, and this allows infection to develop. The most common types of hospital-acquired infections are surgical site infections, respiratory infections, and UTIs, urinary tract infections. Urinary tract infections are super common as healthcare-associated infections because if you think about it, when people go to the hospital for surgery, for various things, having a baby, you get a catheter. Catheters make people very prone to getting UTIs, unfortunately. Also, with surgical site infections, when people have any surgery, from something as simple as getting, what is it called? Your wisdom teeth removed, to something like having surgery, heart surgery. So they're very extreme examples, wisdom teeth and heart surgery, but both of them, you're opening a barrier that is supposed to protect you. Remember your innate immunity, your skin, and therefore you become a lot more vulnerable to infection. With respiratory infections, people get ventilators. So we see pneumonia, very common lung infections in hospitals because people are getting ventilators, and the use of ventilators can spread a lot of different bacteria. For example, Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So common healthcare associated pathogens that we see in hospitals and healthcare settings, and I'm going to go through these, but I want everyone to know most of these are opportunistic pathogens, meaning that they're not pathogens in general, but they can be pathogenic pathogenic when given the opportunity, meaning when someone's immunocompromised. So E. coli and other intestinal bacteria are very common hospital-acquired infections. They can colonize sites when immune defenses are compromised. They can cause a lot of UTIs. E. coli, certain species cause a lot of bad UTIs. Staphylococcus aureus and other staph species can cause skin infections. So they're found naturally on our normal skin flora. So these are part of our microbiota. But if you have the skin broken or breached and they go to an area where they shouldn't be, they can cause very bad infections. Clostridium difficile, or C. diff, is part of our normal flora, but at very, very low numbers. So this bacteria can become deadly if it spreads more than it should. So when you have someone that's immunocompromised, they can get a bad C. diff infection. Pseudomonas aeruginosa is found in moist environments. Like I said, this bacteria needs very few nutrients to grow. So it can colonize the digestive tract of hospitalized patients and cause really many very bad diseases. It can cause UTIs. It's very popular for bad lung infections. So all of these are common hospital-acquired infections. And remember that this is one of the highest causes of death in the US is hospital-acquired infections. We don't think about that. People go into hospital so that they can get treated for something. And a lot of times, unfortunately, they leave with something that could potentially have been more severe than what they came in for. And antibiotic strains are more common. Okay, so the way to prevent healthcare-associated infections is there's something called an infection control committee, and it has various groups of people, various doctors and other members, and they're there to make sure that the hospital is keeping up with standards to make sure that we don't have these hospital-acquired pathogens spread. So there are standard precautions that are let out by the CDC, hand hygiene, making sure that our healthcare workers are washing their hands, personal protective equipment, which unfortunately we had a problem with because a lot of our healthcare workers couldn't get proper masks and PPE to protect themselves. Respiratory hygiene, cough etiquette, patient placements. Don't put 5 patients in one room and crowd them together. Making sure you're cleaning equipment, taking care of the environment, the laundry being done all the time. So just be aware that these are very important things. And a lot of these, I always tell this to my students, a lot of these things may seem like common sense and you think to yourself, I would do them. But a lot of times when a nurse, I'm going to use a nurse as an example since most of you want to be nurses, is given many patients, is overwhelmed, has many people ringing her or him. So the nurse, they might not have time to wash their hands. And you have like 20 things on your mind. So it's human nature. And that's why we really need to stress how important it is to take 1 minute to do these things. And with that, I'm going to end the lecture. So I hope that this lecture is relevant to what's going on and that you guys leave this lecture knowing about the chain of infection, how we can apply that to any outbreak, any disease outbreak, and specifically, how can we break the chain of infection with any outbreak. So we have a COVID-19 outbreak right now, but this is not going to be our last outbreak. So I want you guys to think about this with outbreaks we've seen in the past and in the future, with what's the pathogen, how is it getting in, who's susceptible, how can we break this chain of infection.